Assalamu alaikum, my dear aimers. Hope so you all are doing well. I'm Ariba Nadeem, and the topic we're going to study today is cardiac failure. Let's try to differentiate some of the common terms, which is heart attack, heart failure, and cardiac arrest. So basically, what is heart attack? Heart attack is basically when blood supply to heart is blocked. Heart is supplied by coronary arteries. So whenever there is cholesterol deposition or there is thrombus in your coronary artery or there is atherosclerosis, then the blood flow to the heart is blocked. And when blood flow to heart is blocked, then there is no oxygen supply to heart. And you know why heart needs oxygen? Every cell does respiration with the help of mitochondria. And glucose is broken down in the presence of oxygen into ATP. When there is no oxygen, there is no ATP. When there is no ATP, there is no energy available for the heart muscles to contract. And that leads to death of the heart muscles, which we term as myocardial infarction. Myocardium and infarction means the death. So myocardial infarction means death of the heart muscles due to blockage of coronary arteries. Okay, so heart attack is related to blood supply of heart. Now heart failure. Heart failure is basically the inability of heart to pump the sufficient amount of blood to the body. Heart normally pumps 5 liter blood per minute. If heart is not able to pump this 5 liter blood per minute, that is termed as heart failure. And then comes the term cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest basically means when there is problem in the rhythms of the heart, when the heart suddenly stops beating. Sudden stop beating of the heart suddenly stops beating. When heart suddenly stops beating, this condition is termed as cardiac arrest. You know that heart beats with a normal rhythm, but when that rhythm is disturbed, that is termed as arrhythmia. SA node and AV node in the heart, there is SA node, okay, this is SA node and this is AV node. These two nodes in the heart is basically responsible for generating cardiac impulses, okay, and they're responsible for the normal heartbeat. Like SA node generates 60 to 80 beats per minute, okay, 60 beats per minute. So this is the normal rhythm. If the action potential fired by SA node and AV node is disturbed, causing the arrhythmias, that will ultimately lead to the heart will stop beating, and the sudden stop beating of the heart, that is termed as cardiac arrest. So heart attack is related to blood supply of heart. Heart failure is related to the ability of the heart to pump blood, and cardiac arrest is related to arrhythmias. There is also a term heart block. Basically, whenever there is arrhythmia in the AV node, there is problem in the action potential of AV node, that is simply termed as heart block. Okay, so I hope that you are very clear in these terms. Now I will study cardiac failure. As I told you earlier, that cardiac failure is basically the inability of heart to pump the sufficient amount of blood in the body. Now do remember that cardiac failure doesn't mean that the heart has stopped working. Heart is working, heart is trying to work, but due to some disease, due to some pathology, heart cannot pump enough of the blood to the body. Or it may also happen that the metabolic demand of body increases and that metabolic demand cannot be fulfilled by this 5 liter blood. For example, in case of obesity, the metabolic demand of body increases. So heart is pumping this 5 liter blood, but that is not sufficient for body. So what heart tries to do is, heart tries to do more and more blood, and in doing so, that ultimately leads to the cardiac failure, okay? Now, one point you have to remember over here, that cardiac failure is basically a syndrome, it is not a disease. Now, what is the difference between a disease and a syndrome? Disease simply means any pathology in your body which is often caused by a pathogen. For example, malaria is a disease that is caused by Plasmodium. We know the cause of the disease and we know the signs and symptoms of the disease. But in case of syndrome, always remember, syndrome simply means group of signs and symptoms. Group of signs and symptoms. So cardiac failure is a syndrome. How it is a syndrome? It means that there would be a disease, that disease would exhibit a syndrome, and that syndrome would exhibit a lot of symptoms. For example, let me give you an example. For example, a person is suffering from heart attack. Okay, so whenever there is heart attack, I told you earlier that there is the death of the heart muscles. Whenever there is death of the heart muscles, heart will not be able to pump the required amount of blood for the body. Okay, so that means it leads to Cardiac failure. So heart attack is a disease which is leading to cardiac failure. And then cardiac failure exhibit a lot of signs and symptoms. Like you will see when we will study cardiac failure in detail, you will see that there will be the jugular vein distension, there would be hepatosplenomegaly, there would be edema, there would be the peripheral edema, the pulmonary edema, the pitting edema. There are a lot of symptoms. So syndrome always exhibits, syndrome means a lot of symptoms which may be due to any disease. The cardiac failure may be due to heart failure. The cardiac failure may be due to cardiac arrhythmias. The cardiac failure may be due to valvular heart disease. It may be due to hypertension. So there is a disease that leads to syndrome, and syndrome means a lot of signs and symptoms, and there is not a particular cause. Like malaria has a cause which is plasmodium, but syndrome does not have a specific cause. There may be many causes of syndrome, and now we are going to see what are the possible causes of syndrome. I hope that you are very clear between a disease and a syndrome. Now there are many causes of syndrome out of it, of cardiac failure, out of which we are going to study some of them. First important cause is hypertension. Okay, let's come to this diagram. Basically, I have tried to draw a heart over here, and this is right atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. And basically, I have drawn aorta over here, although it is not here, just for your understanding that blood from left ventricle pumps into the body, and blood from right ventricle goes into the lungs via pulmonary artery and into body via aorta. Okay. Now you see that whenever blood is pumped, the pressure in the left ventricle is 120 mm of mercury, and pressure in aorta is 80 mm of mercury. There is high pressure in left ventricle, there is low pressure in aorta. So ultimately blood goes from left ventricle into the aorta. But what if a person is suffering from hypertension? If there is already higher blood pressure in aorta or in the body, then left, for example, the blood pressure already in aorta is 140, while the blood pressure in left ventricle is 120. Then it is harder for the ventricle to pump blood into the high pressured body. Okay, so ventricle has to work a lot to pump blood against this high pressure. So the ventricle will not be able to pump the blood, and the cardiac output will decrease, and ultimately that would lead to the cardiac failure. So hypertension leads to cardiac failure by increasing the blood pressure. Second important reason is myocardial infarction. As we studied earlier, that whenever there is myocardial infarction, there would ultimately be the death of the muscles of heart. The muscles will not contract and the blood will not be pumped to the body. So done with myocardial infarction. Third one is the valvular heart diseases. Valvular heart diseases means the diseases related to the valves of the heart. So there are two possible diseases related to the valves of the heart. First is stenosis, and second one is regurgitation. Stenosis, the literal meaning of stenosis is narrowing down. Okay, so suppose these are the cusp. Okay, I'm going to make a valve with my hand. These are the cusp, and this is the orifice or the opening of the valve. These are the cusp of the valves, and this is the opening of the valve. If this opening of valve narrows down, that is termed as stenosis. So if the opening of valve, for example, this is the opening and it has narrowed down. So the blood cannot be pumped from left atrium to left ventricle. All the blood cannot be pumped. So left ventricle would have less amount of blood or less end diastolic volume. Okay. So what will happen? Ultimately the cardiac output will be decreased, and that we say it as cardiac failure. So whenever there is stenosis, less amount of blood is pumped from atrium into ventricle and ultimately from ventricle into the body, so the cardiac output decreases. What is regurgitation? Regurgitation, the literal meaning of regurgitation is backflow. Okay, what happens in case of regurgitation? That this opening of the valve, okay, it is somehow like this, that these, the cusp are displaced. So the valves cannot close properly. If these cusps are displaced, there are many reasons of regurgitation. I'm just telling you that if this cusp are suppose displaced, then this opening cannot be closed. Okay, so what will happen? There will be the backflow of blood from right ventricle into left ventricle into left atrium, and ultimately when there will be backflow of blood, there will be less blood in left ventricle, there will be less diastolic volume, there will be less cardiac output. So that will lead to heart failure. Okay, the last possible reason is arrhythmias. I told you earlier what is arrhythmias: abnormal beating of the heart, problem is in SA node action potential, or problem in AV node action potential. So whenever there are arrhythmias, and arrhythmias are of two types. If there is too much slow heartbeat, that is bradycardia, and if there is too much fast heartbeat, that is tachycardia. So suppose a person is suffering from bradycardia and its heartbeat is so slow. If heartbeat is so slow, The action potential from SNO to AV node is so slow, from AV node to ventricles is so slow, so the cardiac output will be decreased, the per minute cardiac output will be decreased. Okay, so understood that whenever the action potential is slow, it means the heart which was pumping 5 liter blood per minute, it will not pump 5 liter blood per minute. Suppose now it is now pumping, as the heartbeat is slow, so suppose it is pumping 4 liter blood per minute. Okay, so that will lead to cardiac failure. And if it is tachycardia, for example, if heart is beating so fast, then it would not be able to eject all of the blood from the left ventricle, all the 70 ml blood from the left ventricle per heartbeat. Okay, so it will not be able to eject all the blood, left ventricle will not be able to eject all the blood per beat, which is 70 ml, so stroke volume will decrease and ultimately there would be the heart failure. So till now what have we studied? That what is the difference between heart attack, heart failure and cardiac arrest? Cardiac failure is a syndrome, means it's a group of signs and symptoms. So we will study the signs and symptoms later and then you will clearly understand why we are calling it as a syndrome. And then we studied about the possible causes of the cardiac failure, which may be hypertension, myocardial infarction, valvular disease and arrhythmias. Okay students, now we will study some of the different types of heart failure. There are many types of heart failure on different bases. First base is on the basis of the site of heart involved, means the right side of the heart has been failed or the left side of the heart has been failed. So we call it as right-sided heart failure and left-sided heart failure. Then second one is based on the type of function affected. If there is a problem in systolic, then that would be the systolic heart failure. If there is a problem in diastole, that would be termed as diastolic heart failure. Then we study cardiac failure on the basis of cardiac output. It may sound weird to you now at this time, but we will study it in detail, that there is a high output cardiac failure and a low output cardiac failure, low cardiac output cardiac failure. And then the last one is based on compensation mechanisms, compensated heart failure and decompensated heart failure. Out of all these types, these first two types, the site of the heart and function affected, these are the most important ones. Okay, so for now we will study the first type, which is on the basis of the site of heart involved, and that is the right-sided heart failure and a left-sided heart failure. Firstly, we are going to study the right-sided heart failure. Right-sided heart failure simply means that right side of the heart has been failed to pump the blood. Firstly, be clear that blood from right side of the heart, like from right ventricle, is pumped into the pulmonary arteries for the oxygenation. Firstly, let's draw a flow chart for a common to understand the pathway following in the right side of the heart. So we all know that blood from left ventricle is pumped into the aorta and ultimately into the arteries. Okay, and from arteries the blood goes into arterioles, and from arterioles it reaches into the organs at the level of capillaries. From the capillaries the blood goes into when oxygenation take place, when tissue exchange take place, then nutrients exchange take place in the tissues, then it goes into venules. Venules makes up veins. Veins drain into superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, and superior and inferior vena cava ultimately drain into right atrium. Right atrium drains into right ventricle, and right ventricle drains into pulmonary artery. Okay, so you all know this common passageway which is followed on the right side of the heart. Okay, these are two in number. Now what happens in case of right-sided heart failure? It means that the right ventricle, due to some pathology, is not able to pump blood into the lungs. So what happens that when the right ventricle is not able to pump the blood, then blood stays into right ventricle, and that blood creates a lot of pressure into right ventricle. At that time, the valve which is present between right atrium and right ventricle, which is tricuspid valve, is closed. Because blood is pumped from right atrium to right ventricle, the valve is open. As the right ventricle has to contract, then the valve closes. But in case when the blood is not pumped from the right ventricle, all the blood is stayed into the right ventricle, then pressure of blood in right ventricle increases. And that pressure increases so much that the valve opens and the blood starts to backflow. And do you know from where the blood backflows? Blood is not able to be pumped into the right ventricle. This passage has been cancelled. And now we are going to study the backflow. The blood will backflow from right ventricle into the right atrium, from right atrium into superior vena cava and into inferior vena cava. Do remember, here the blood pressure was raised and that causes the valve, tricuspid valve to open. Okay, but superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, they don't have valves. Azygous vein also don't have valve. Okay, so superior vena cava and inferior vena cava don't have any valves, so blood will easily backflow from superior vena into superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, ultimately into veins, ultimately into venules, and then into the capillaries. Okay, so blood and capillaries are basically at the tissue level, at the organ level. So blood is backflowing, and the deoxygenated blood, because here the oxygenation has not been done, the blood was not pumped into the pulmonary artery, so the deoxygenated blood is backflowing from right ventricle into right atrium, into superior and inferior vena cava, back into veins, back into venules, back into capillaries. So this is basically, and you know, the right ventricle blood has been backflowed, so the blood to the lungs will not be enough, and ultimately blood to left atrium will not be enough, into left ventricle will not be enough, and ultimately to the body will not be enough. Cardiac output will decrease, and we will term it as cardiac failure. So this is what we call it as right-sided heart failure. Okay students, now we are going to study the pathogenesis of right-sided heart failure. Means what are the possible causes or the diseases which ultimately lead to cardiac failure. As I told you earlier that cardiac failure is a syndrome, so there must be a disease which is causing it. So there are many causes of right-sided heart failure, but we are going to discuss only the important ones. First cause of the right-sided heart failure is right ventricular afterload is increased. What is meant by afterload? Afterload simply means the resistance against which a ventricle has to pump blood. Okay, let me explain all in once and then you will understand all. For example, this afterload is increased in case of hypertension. What happens in case of hypertension? You know, this right ventricle has to pump the blood into this pulmonary artery. Okay, let me give you example from the left ventricle first. This left ventricle has to pump the blood into aorta, ultimately into the body. You know that the pressure in the left ventricle, that is 120 mm of mercury, while pressure in the body, that is 80 mm of mercury. So it is easy for the blood to go from high pressure to the low pressure. But what if a body is in state of hypertension? What if the blood pressure of the body in the aorta is already 140? Then it is harder for the ventricle to pump blood into the body. So the blood will not be pumped into the body and the cardiac output will decrease, and that will ultimately cause the cardiac failure. Okay, and second thing, in hypertension, what happens and why there is hypertension? There is hypertension because it means that there is constriction of arterioles. And when the constriction of arterioles is there, it means the resistance has been increased, because if there is this artery, resistance is offered by the walls of these arteries. Okay, so if the diameter is greater, then the blood flowing over here experiences less resistance. But what if blood is flowing through this constricted arteriole? Then that experiences more resistance. So whenever the resistance is increased, the blood pressure is increased, and if there is hypertension, then it is difficult for the ventricle to pump blood into the body. Same goes for the right ventricle. What if there is hypertension in pulmonary artery? Then it is difficult for the right ventricle to pump blood into the pulmonary artery, because pulmonary artery already has high pressure. So the pulmonary hypertension basically increases the resistance against which the blood needs to be pumped. So the resistance for the ventricle increases, and ultimately that leads to the right-sided heart failure. Second reason for the increased afterload is stenosis. You know that pulmonary hypertension, and the second reason is the pulmonary valve stenosis. You know the pulmonary valve is present between right ventricle and pulmonary artery. When the right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary artery, then this valve closes so that the blood should not go back into the right ventricle. But what if this pulmonary valve is suffering from stenosis? Means the opening of pulmonary valve is now narrow. Now when blood comes from right ventricle into the pulmonary artery, sorry, I spoke wrong. Blood goes from right ventricle into pulmonary artery, and then this valve closes. This valve opens, okay? Because you know this is right ventricle and this is pulmonary artery, and here is a valve. So this valve opens when blood comes from right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. Okay. So if there is the stenosis of this valve, if the opening of this valve is so narrow, then the blood cannot pump from right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. So there will be less blood into pulmonary artery, less blood will go into lungs, less blood will be received by left atrium, less blood will come to left ventricle, and less blood will be pumped to the body. So that will lead to the cardiac failure. Got it? So increased afterload is ultimately whenever there would be the stenosis, ultimately it would be difficult for the right ventricle to pump blood against the pulmonary artery. So afterload will be increased. So afterload is increase in pulmonary hypertension and pulmonary stenosis. Afterload simply means the pressure or the resistance against which the blood has to be pumped. Okay. So second reason is decreased in ventricular contraction. I told you earlier that whenever there is myocardial infarction, there is the death of heart muscles. So if there is myocardial infarction and the right ventricle heart muscles has been died, then it will not be able to pump the blood, and that will ultimately lead to the cardiac failure. So second reason is very simple, myocardial infarction. Okay, third reason is the reason related to the valves of the ventricle, valves related to the right side of the heart. So you know that there is a tricuspid valve and there is a pulmonary valve. And if there is a regurgitation in any of these valves, for example, if there is a regurgitation in tricuspid valve, means the tricuspid valve is not closed properly. So when the right ventricle will contract, the blood will backflow from right ventricle into right atrium, and less blood will be received by the pulmonary artery and ultimately by the left ventricle, ultimately by the body. Okay. And if there is a regurgitation in pulmonary valve, then the blood will backflow from pulmonary artery into right ventricle to the right atrium, ultimately into superior and inferior vena cava, and the less blood will be received ultimately by this left ventricle and ultimately by the body. So whenever there are diseases related to the valves of the right side of the heart, that ultimately leads to cardiac failure. So what are some of the causes of the cardiac failure? It can be the afterload is increased, like in case of pulmonary hypertension and pulmonary artery stenosis. The ventricular contraction is decreased, like in case of myocardial infarction, or any disease which is affecting the valves of the right side of the heart, which is tricuspid valve regurgitation and the pulmonary valve regurgitation. So what are the signs and symptoms of right-sided heart failure? First, very important sign is jugular venous distension. You know that the blood is backflowing from right ventricle to right atrium, from right atrium into superior vena cava. As I told you that superior vena cava does not have any valves, so blood easily backflows from right atrium into the superior vena cava. And you all know that superior vena cava is ultimately connected to jugular vein. Okay, so blood backflows from right ventricle to right atrium, from right atrium to superior vena cava, and to superior vena cava to jugular vein, and you will see a distended jugular vein. Okay, so that is the first sign of right-sided heart failure. It does not happen in left-sided heart failure, because in left side blood does not come to superior vena cava to jugular vein. Okay, so it is a sign of right-sided heart failure. Second important sign is pitting edema. What happens that blood backflows from right ventricle to right atrium, from right atrium to inferior vena cava, from inferior vena cava to veins, veins to venules, and venules to the venous end of capillaries. You know that capillary has two ends. So suppose this is the venous end of capillary and this is the arterial end of capillary. This end of capillary receives oxygenated blood. The oxygen and the nutrients get exchanged between the capillary and the tissue, and the deoxygenated blood then goes into the venules and then ultimately into veins, and from veins into inferior vena cava and all that stuff. So this is the venous end of the capillary. So blood is backflowing from right atrium to inferior vena cava to veins to venules to capillaries, and ultimately comes to this venous end of capillary. Okay, so what happens that the blood is backflowing, so there is a lot of blood at this venous side. What happens that the capillary hydrostatic pressure increases so much. You know, this capillary is made up of endothelium cells. Okay, this capillary is made up of endothelial cells. So this capillary hydrostatic pressure increases so much that a lot of plasma from capillary comes into the interstitial spaces. This is a cell, this is a capillary, and the space between them is called as, this is a cell, or you may call it as a tissue. This is an interstitial space. Okay, and a fluid coming out of capillary into this interstitial space is called as interstitial fluid. So a lot of interstitial fluid accumulates over here. Okay, so whenever there is a lot of interstitial fluid, then that condition is termed as edema, abnormal accumulation of interstitial fluid. And this edema is a pitting edema. Like if you will put a finger on the leg of a person, then that will go deep. That is a pitting one. So there is a pitting edema and a peripheral edema, you may say, that is in legs and that is in hands or arm, you may say. Okay, so there is a pitting edema or a peripheral edema. What if this blood goes back from inferior vena cava to veins, and to which vein? To portal vein. Suppose the blood is going into the portal vein. Portal vein is related to liver. So blood is going back into the portal vein, and you know that the portal vein the liver does not have these capillaries. Liver have sinusoids. You know what are the sinusoids? You know, this capillary, it has endothelium. It is made up of single layer of endothelium. Okay, and this endothelium has pores into it, which basically allows the release of plasma, the release of nutrients, basically the release of plasma into the interstitial fluid, and from where the nutrients oxygen diffuses into the tissue. But these pores do not allow the entry or the release of red blood cells and the proteins. Red blood cells and proteins cannot cross these pores, okay? But in case of liver, liver synthesizes a lot of proteins. If we want to synthesize a protein, we need a liver. Okay, so suppose liver has synthesized albumin. Now this albumin is needed by this tissue. How will this albumin be transported to this tissue? This albumin will come to venules, this albumin will come to capillaries, and then the capillaries pores are so small that the exchange cannot take place. Okay, it will not come to venules, it will come from arterial side. Okay, so this pores are so small. So what happens that in case of liver, we have sinusoids. Sinusoids have a very large pores in the endothelial cells through which the proteins can easily cross. So liver synthesizes this albumin, transfers this albumin into these sinusoids through these large pores, and from these large pores the proteins releases into the interstitial space again and then goes into the tissue. Similarly, the bone marrow synthesizes RBCs. These RBCs needs to be synthesized and to be transported into the capillary. That again also the sinusoids are present. Sinusoids are basically a type of capillary which has large pores. So bone marrow needs to transport RBCs, so RBCs cross these pores easily and reach the desired place. Similarly, spleen is a graveyard of RBCs. It has to take the destructive RBCs. So spleen has sinusoids. Liver in early life liver synthesizes RBCs, so it has sinusoids. In the late life liver basically breaks RBCs, so it has sinusoids. So liver, spleen, and bone marrow has sinusoids. So basically what happens that this blood backflows from right ventricle to right atrium and then to inferior vena cava and then to portal vein, and from portal vein it gets back to the, instead of capillaries it has a special type of capillary which is a sinusoids. And from sinusoid again what happens that the plasma, that from sinusoids the plasma, lot of plasma along with the proteins that releases into this interstitial space. And you know that this liver is situated where is this liver situated? In abdomen, and in peritoneal cavity. So a lot of fluid builds up in the peritoneal cavity or a peritoneal space that is termed as ascites. Okay, so the condition of ascite will easily be prominent on abdomen. Okay, okay, so what happens that the blood backflows into the portal vein into the liver, and from liver sinusoids the blood is released into the interstitial space along with the proteins, along with the blood cells, and that condition is termed as ascites. Next important sign is hepatosplenomegaly. This is already again related to it, that blood backflows from inferior vena cava to veins of liver, and ultimately there's a lot of blood buildup in the liver, and that causes the enlargement of liver and ultimately the spleen. That is called as hepatosplenomegaly. There is a last sign which is hepatojugular reflex. What is hepatojugular reflex? Basically, when you put a pressure on the upper part of abdomen, then what happens due to compression of veins over that area, the venous return to the heart is increased. As a result, this right atrium activates the compensatory mechanism to compensate that increased venous return. When the blood backflows as a result of compression, when there is a venous return is increased, then ultimately what happens? Venous return is increased, so ultimately there would be the jugular venous distension. The blood will ultimately go to the jugular vein. Okay, so when the blood will go to jugular vein, there would be jugular vein distension, and the blood will go to the right atrium, and it would be a clear symptom. It would be a sign for the right atrium to compensate this increased venous return, and this jugular vein comes back to normal after some time. But in case of right-sided heart failure, if you put a pressure on the abdomen and you increase the venous return, then this right atrium has been failed. It cannot pump the blood. It cannot compensate that increased venous return. So what happens that when you put a pressure in case of right-sided heart failure, then this jugular vein remains distended. It does not come back to normal. So that is a clear-cut sign of the right-sided heart failure. Okay, so what have we studied till now? We studied about the right-sided heart failure. We studied how the pathophysiology of the right-sided heart failure. Then we studied the possible causes of the right-sided heart failure, and then we studied the clinical findings. There is jugular venous distension, there is pitting edema, there is ascites, there is hepatosplenomegaly, and there is hepatojugular reflex. One very easy trick to diagnose the right-sided heart failure is that whenever you have problems, any problem related to any organ except the lungs, that would indicate right-sided heart failure. If there is a problem mentioned in the lungs like pulmonary edema or a breathing problem or dyspnea, all that would be related to left-sided heart failure. But if there are problems in other organs, like there's a problem in liver, like there's a problem in abdomen, like there's a problem in spleen, there's a hepatojugular reflex, there's a problem in GIT, even in GIT distress, if there is weight loss, there's anorexia. So that all these problems, they are the sign of right-sided heart failure. Okay, so this is an easy trick to remember. This is an easy trick to diagnose the right-sided heart failure basically. So this is all for today. Video is going long and long. So we will study the left-sided heart failure in the next video. Till then, if you have got the lecture, then please like the video. Do subscribe to my YouTube channel. See you in the next video. Allah Hafiz.